A new NATO military defence force has been launched to protect the undersea cables in the Baltic Sea from being damaged. Incidents are on the rise, with Norway and Sweden recently seizing vessels they suspect of sabotage. So, what's behind the cable cuttings, and can they be stopped? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the number of cables being damaged in the Baltic Sea is on the rise, with NATO taking action to protect the critical infrastructure. Security officials say it's likely the result of maritime accidents. But some countries in the region, including Estonia, suspect sabotage due to the frequency of the incidents.
NATO ships on patrol in the Baltic Sea, working to safeguard critical undersea infrastructure like data cables and pipelines. It follows a series of unexplained incidents over the past 3 years.
The main thing is to show that we are checking all the vessels that are passing through this area. So we are basically preventing or trying to prevent anything else bad from happening.
NATO has launched Operation Baltic Sentry. It's deploying ships, surveillance aircraft and drones to protect the area. The military alliance wants to deter further attempts of sabotage, at a time when Russia is suspected of being behind other alleged incidents within Europe.
Russia is trying to destabilize our countries and is challenging the resilience of our societies, with acts ranging from assassination attempts to cyber attacks to sabotage.
But Russia's foreign ministry says NATO is exploiting the situation.
They're taking advantage of the situation to boost the alliance's military presence in the Baltic Sea. The real goal of all this is to limit the export of Russian oil by any means.
Over 11 cables vital for the flow of energy and internet services have been damaged so far, prompting concerns over the vulnerability of the critical underwater networks. Can NATO's military power prevent further cable cuttings? And is it intentional sabotage or a simple wave of shipping accidents?
Well, let's bring in our guests in Brussels. We have Shea. He's former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. In Alicante, in Spain, we have Marina Miron. She's a researcher at the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. And in Boston, Massachusetts, we have Julian Rawle, who is undersea fibre optic cable specialist. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Julian, I want to start with you. Once might be an accident, twice might be coincidental. This is not a coincidence that these cables are getting damaged, is it?
Let me put it this way. There are over 500 operational commercial cables delivering internet around the world. And every year we have between 200 and 300 faults on those cables caused by different sources. So if you do the math, every cable should expect to have one hit every 2 years.
But it's happening a lot more often than that, isn't it, Julian?
To each cable, I mean. So, this is perfectly normal in our industry. It's just that the rest of the world has realized how important submarine fiber optic cables are for the way we live today. And so the awareness of these cable faults has been raised over the last 2 or 3 years.
Marina, just spell out for our viewers what these cables do, why they're so important and the role they're playing in our daily lives.
Well, given the fact that they have been featured in the news in the past months, I guess everybody's now realizing how critical undersea infrastructure is, specifically for that data transmission. And we know that we live in an interconnected world. That's why we have alternatives to internet introduced by the likes of Elon Musk in order to look for a more secure alternative. But for now, we're stuck with undersea cables connecting different countries. And therefore, if you look at cyber attacks and how damaging cyber attacks can be, if we look at 2007 cyber attack on Estonia and everything is functioning using the internet, and that was 18 years ago. So now it's even more important that we remain connected, that we remain online, not just for our day-to-day lives, but also for defense and security, for the stock markets, and so on. So it is critical infrastructure.
Jamie, given how important these cables are then, how worried should Europe be about the threats being posed under our seas?
Well, they are very important because, for example, they are telecommunications cables, are very important, obviously, for the data transmission, the data economy. But there are also, of course, gas cables as well, particularly as Europe tries to import more gas from Norway, for instance, across the Baltic Sea into Poland, and increase its gas dependency on Russia. And also, of course, the Baltic states, which used to have all of their energy imports coming in from Russia, have now connected to the European grid. So they have sort of become more dependent rather than less on this Baltic infrastructure as they seek to be supplied from their European allies. The other problem, Enda, is the Baltic Sea is quite a shallow sea, and you have up to 20,000, 25,000 ships using it every year, which means that there's a lot of ships in a very congested area in close proximity to cable. So even if malicious intent is not involved, the chances of accidents increase as well. There are other problems, by the way, from environmental damage. If some of these oil tankers, particularly the Russian shadow fleet tankers, loading in Russia and then trying to export Russian oil abroad, for example, run aground. And that's happened, we know, with a Russian tanker in the Black Sea. A Russian shadow fleet tanker has sunk off the coast of Spain. So the environmental risk is there, and not just the risk of cables being severed.
So, Julian, who owns these cables? Are they owned by countries or private companies?
99% of them are owned by private entities, either private entrepreneurs or consortia of telephone companies, some of them incumbent telephone companies, some private second operators. The government involvement in actually owning and operating cables is very, very limited.
So I'm guessing if private companies own them, there won't be that kind of defense infrastructure that a country would have.
That's absolutely right, but that's not to say that the industry is complacent about the issue of protecting its cables. Obviously, these cables represent significant amounts of revenue. So ever since submarine fiber optic cables have been used for commercial purposes, which is about 45 years, we have had maintenance arrangements in place all over the world to ensure that any cable break is addressed very quickly. In addition to that, there are very strong efforts. There's a body called the International Cable Protection Committee, which promotes awareness of cables, both at the government level down to the trawler level, keeping fishermen and other marine users aware of where the cables are. We have technology that tells us when ships are getting too close to the cables, and we can radio them and tell them to take evasive action. So although it's in the private sector, there's a strong profit incentive to make sure these cables keep operating.
So, Marina, do you welcome NATO upping its game and increasing its defence of undersea cables?
Well, we've heard Jamie talking statistics in terms of how often these cables can get damaged. Now, the question is, if we look at it statistically, just because we singled out a few instances and that appeared on the news, and one of those instances was believed to be sabotage of those cables, does it mean that increasing or putting a lot of resources into something that has been functioning like that in other words, that incidents with cables are a norm, it's not an exception, is this going to change anything really, because patrolling the Baltic Sea requires a lot of resources. You cannot ensure 100% coverage. And the other thing is, what do you get in return? Is it worth the trouble? Or is it an overreaction here? Or is there something bigger? Is this more of a deterrent to the Russians, to the Russian shadow fleet, or what be it, rather than about the so-called protection of the undersea cable specifically, because those incidents in the Baltic Sea, due to the geology, are quite frequent.
Jamie, Russia will no doubt say it's doing nothing wrong and this is Western paranoia again. How concerned are you about the so-called shadow fleet that Russia and others may be operating?
Well, the shadow fleet, Enda, has multiple purposes. Obviously, for Russia commercially to be able to export its oil out to markets. We know that Russia gets about 16 billion euros in revenue for that every year, and that finances the Ukraine war effort. So those 400 shadow fleet tankers are a real lifeline for Russia in invading Western sanctions and keeping going in Ukraine. The second thing is they're old tankers, many of them 18, 20 years old. As I mentioned earlier, they break down, they have accidents, so they represent a severe environmental risk. In fact, ironically, one of the worst environmental disasters in Russia's recent history is one of its own shadow tankers going aground in the Kerch Strait, and a cleanup operation lasted for months. So that is a worry, particularly in the Baltic Sea, the German coast, the Swedish coast, Danish coast, etc., where you could have that beach pollution in the middle of the summer tourist season. But the third issue, of course, is the fact that they could be used for these operations, particularly the dragging of the anchors along the seabed, as said earlier, although sometimes the results are somewhat inconclusive. So NATO wants to keep an eye on the activities of that shadow fleet. The other thing is that the Russians have a certain number of sort of research vessels, as they like to call them. One was recently shadowed by the UK in the North Sea, which seemed to be sort of mapping critical infrastructure, and that could be part of war preparations. Ireland, your own country, has had similar experiences off its western coast with Russian ships as well, and in the vicinity, for example, off the coast of Norway, an oil drilling platform. So NATO and the EU have set up a joint task force to try to share information on these kind of incidents, to try to figure out what's going on. But as your previous speakers have said, identifying the threat is one thing, being able to effectively prevent it is something else, if you're not in the right place at the right time. But at least NATO ships in the Baltic Sea can, as was said, can steer the commercial shipping away from obvious vulnerability areas, prevent, if you like, accidents. The second thing is that if a ship is really behaving strangely, loitering over an important cable, why would it be doing that? Then there is the possibility of intercepting that ship and towing it into port for inspection, as Finland, for example, has currently done with one of the suspect tankers.
Julian, is it a concern for the United Kingdom that this Russian research vessel Yantar keeps being spotted in UK waters around areas of critical infrastructure?
Well, I think generally one should be aware and concerned about foreign vessel activity in your territorial waters, or even in the extended economic zone. But I question what kind of threat it is posing to submarine fiber optic cables. To be honest, if they have technology that allows them to locate cables without actually being connected to the cable, which is the way that we do it, we'd be really interested to have that technology, because at the moment, if you have a cable break, you have to send a vessel out and you drop a grapnel, a hook off the back of the vessel, and you drag it along until you pick up the cable. Cables move on the seabed. We have records of where they've been originally laid, but they can move. So it's actually very difficult to locate a cable. And as Jamie was saying, a vessel that is behaving oddly, trawling up and down in a particular location is going to attract attention very quickly. We have satellite technology monitoring all the marine traffic. From a submarine cable point of view, I don't see the Yantar or any vessel like it posing a major threat or being particularly sinister. Maybe it's doing other things. Tracking pipelines is a different thing. Going back to Jamie's point originally about the explosion on the Gazprom pipeline, pipelines are far larger and easier to find on the seabed than submarine cable. So you shouldn't conflate those two. Sabotage of a gas pipeline is completely different to trying to sabotage a submarine cable. And in fact, if I were a saboteur, I would attack the cable landing stations, not the cable under the water.
So, Marina, that's an interesting point from Julian there, saying that, if he were a saboteur, it's where these pipelines are coming ashore, where these cables come ashore, that's where he would be focusing his attention. But I guess if you're going to target land, you're actually going on people's soil and you're drawing attention to yourself. I guess there is a huge risk as opposed to the murky depths of the ocean.
Well, on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, we have seen Russian intelligence services being quite adept at finding ways to conduct sabotage. And I'm talking now more about sabotage on land, and the problem with sabotage and the problem with what the Russian intelligence has been doing is outsourcing sabotage operations on the UK soil, on the European soil. It's very difficult to prove because you don't have a legal construct that would prosecute sabotage specifically. So you have criminal law, and you can violate criminal law, such as in the case of arson. Arson is arson. Now, to take that extra step and to prove that it's sabotage, your evidence is going to be anecdotal at best because you have to prove intentions. Therefore, I think that we shouldn't be too worried about vessels, Russian vessels, if they are not behaving in a dodgy way, because I think the Russians have quite a lot of different venues to exploit, and that might just be signal sending or just be randomly there, and we're over focusing on it, being overly paranoid. But generally speaking, when it comes to sabotage, I think same with counterterrorism. If there is a terrorist attack on an airport and then you increase airport security, you can rest assured that a terrorist organization is not going to attack an airport again because it's a hardened target now. And the same goes with undersea cables or even with any sort of critical infrastructure on land.
Jamie, to you, I'm guessing you welcome everything NATO is doing at the moment, this Baltic Sentry operation. NATO's clearly investing a lot of money in defence.
Well, it's been demanded almost by the NATO allies that are in that region. And Finland recently hosted a summit, not with everybody from NATO, but with the NATO Secretary General, with the EU Vice President, because the EU is involved also in this operation, particularly in intelligence sharing and the dialogue with industry and those kind of aspects. So the countries of the region, who are, of course, the ones who suffer, first and foremost, when these cables are severed, want NATO action in that area. And of course, it's in a way convenient for NATO because the Baltic Sea is part of NATO's collective defence zone in any case, and NATO would be there in any case with its ships. It doesn't have to sort of send them to the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden far away, as was the case with the Houthis or a couple of years ago dealing with piracy. But it's a difficult operation because it involves ships, it involves drones, it involves maritime patrol aircraft, Coast Guard Guard vessels, submarines, the whole kit caboodle, in order to have an effective monitoring presence. And that means that, of course, it's going to be demanding on NATO, as ships have to rotate in and out, and countries take back these assets, to be able to sort of keep that effort up, which is quite intensive and costly over a period of time. But it's certainly a way that NATO can demonstrate solidarity. NATO has a centre at its Maritime Command at Northwood, just north of London, which is its centre for infrastructure security, again, which can exchange information with insurers, with the private sector, build up a pattern of situational awareness. There's also, by the way, Enda, a number of these shadow vessels which are subject to sanctions by the US, by the UK, by the EU. They've been named and shamed. The United States has put sanctions on 183 of these shadow fleet vessels. So to the extent that they are identified as still operating, they can also be taken into harbours and checked as well and stopped, which is another part of the deterrent function.
Julian, to you, when you speak to senior leaders in your industry, how much of a problem do they view this as?
Well, I think they share my view that we're really, really happy to see governments finally recognizing how important these submarine fiber optic cables are, and mobilizing some government resources to help us incrementally protect the cables. Beyond that, however, I share Marina's view that really there's a lot of hype around the whole sabotage theory about cables, and that really, if we're going to have military vessels, naval vessels out on the oceans looking for saboteurs to protect the cables, we'd like them also to be helping us to warn away ships and fishing activity, because that's where the vast proportion of damage occurs.
So, Marina, just on that point to you, finally, I mean, is there any way that the fishing community and everyone else involved in accidental damage, can they be warned about where these cables are, or is it national secrecy level stuff?
Well, perhaps, and as has already been discussed, if they get into the vicinity of a cable and there is a danger that the cable might be damaged by accident or otherwise, that the vessel would be warned then in order to prevent any sort of incidents. Now, giving out the layout of critical infrastructure might not even be useful to those who cannot quite navigate the ocean or the seafloor and don't know exactly where these cables are located. Therefore, I question the utility of laying bare the plans where these cables are laid, but a mechanism, a warning mechanism, as Julian has already pointed out, saying to the vessel, be careful, 3 nautical miles to the west, there is a cable, just bear that in mind, or whatever it is that the message gets transmitted. That kind of mechanism, I think, could potentially help prevent specific incidents. But then again, depending on the vessel, depending on whose vessel it is, whether you have communication with that vessel, especially if it's something, one of Russia's shadow fleet vessels, then you might not necessarily have the means to communicate with them effectively. That being said, it's still worth a try, and I think it's a low resource option because somebody will have to foot the bill for monitoring the waters, and it can get quite expensive, especially if you look at the overall picture when it comes to NATO and NATO's future and the need for restocking and so on, and the need to increase defense spending of individual NATO member states, specifically European member states. And then it becomes quite an expensive venture, and the benefit to it, what is the actual payoff? Is it really worth it?
Jamie, last question. Is it media hype, or are we right to be suspicious?
Well, it's obviously an issue, given, of course, the seriousness of these disruptions. For example, Estonia lost potentially 50% of its electricity supply when one of its so-called S-Link cables over to Finland was severed. And if that happens in the middle of winter, Enda, with minus 25 temperatures, then certainly, yes, the population could certainly feel it. So redundancy is important. Industry, what it could do to make the cables less easily damaged, the hardening, all of that is important. But I think at the end of the day, the key challenge for NATO is to have an intelligent operation. Not every ship is a saboteur. Many of the vessels are Western vessels, which you don't think would be involved in this. So it's really a question of using these maritime assets, not just to sail up and down in the hope that maybe they will accidentally discover a saboteur ship, but to have an artificial intelligence-driven operation, which is what the UK is doing at the moment in the Baltic with the Joint Expeditionary Force, to try to really identify, the potentially suspect ships and the potentially suspect areas, intervene and deal with those particular things, allowing 90% of the innocent shipping to go on its way. So going from, this quick rush in, because yes, there was a certain degree of media hype, you're right, Enda, but to go from that to a long-term intelligent operation, which can focus on the real problem areas, and we'll see. Only time will tell if this is effective in deterring and stopping the problem. The proof of the pudding will be in the sailing, if not the eating.
Jamie, Julian and Marina, thank you all so much for your insight on this one. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.